We're going to be talking about these Hardy-Weinberg equations and what we use them for. Remember we said that a population is evolving if we're getting a change in allele frequencies over time. Well, these equations help us determine allele frequencies. We have to be able to calculate them so that we can see if they're changing over time, so we can tell if the population is evolving or not. Remember, if allele frequencies change from generation to generation, then evolution is occurring. If allele frequencies do not change, then we say the population is not evolving. There's two Hardy-Weinberg equations that you need to become familiar with, and both of them are listed on your AP formula sheet that you can use on the AP exam. But they only give you what P stands for and Q stands for. So you're going to have memorized what P squared, 2PQ, and Q squared symbolize. Let's take a look at this first equation and figure out what it means. P represents the frequency of the dominant allele in a population. So if you think about it, if 80% of the alleles are that dominant allele, then we know that 20% of the alleles are going to be the recessive allele. So we can write this two different ways. We can say the frequency of the B allele is 0.8, or we can say 80% of the alleles are the dominant allele. If 80% of the alleles are the dominant alleles, then that means 20% of the alleles are the recessive alleles. Q represents the frequency of the recessive alleles in a population. So we can either say 20% of the alleles are those little a's, or those recessive alleles, or we can say 0.2. They occur at a frequency of 0.2. Now, when you look at this equation, you can see that P plus Q has to add up to 1. So we look at our decimals here. This is the frequency of the dominant allele. This is the frequency of the recessive allele. They must add up to 1, and they do in this case. 0.8 plus 0.2 equals 1. So those check out. If we want to turn this into percents, this means 80%. So 80% of the alleles are dominant alleles, which means 20% of the alleles are the recessive alleles. If we add those up, then we should get all of the alleles accounted for, 100% of the alleles in the population. Now let's take a look at this other equation. So we have P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared. Again, P squared, 2PQ, and Q squared are not identified for you on your AP formula sheet. Just the equation is identified, but it doesn't tell you what P squared stands for and so on. You need to know that P squared stands for the frequency of the homozygous dominant individuals. So here's what I mean by that. Let's say 30% of the population has this genotype. 30% of the population is homozygous dominant. Then we're going to say P squared equals 0.3. 2PQ is representing the frequency of the heterozygous individuals. Remember, P has to deal with the dominant allele. Q is going to have to deal with the recessive allele. If you have a dominant recessive allele, then you're heterozygous. So this means that heterozygotes are going to make up 50% of the population. 50% of the population is comprised of individuals that are big A, little a. Or we can say 2PQ in this situation would be 0.5 or 0.50. And then finally, Q squared represents the frequency of the homozygous recessive individuals. So that means 20% of the population has this genotype. Or we say this genotype occurs at a frequency of 0.2. So Q squared equals 0.2 in this situation. Now, our decimals are going to have to add up to 1. So if we plug these numbers into the equation, so if P squared equals 0.3, 0.3 plus 2PQ is 0.5 plus Q squared, which is 0.2, those should equal 1. Or if we turn those into percents, 30% plus 50% plus 20% should equal 100%. Now, let's take a look at problems that you're going to see related to these Hardy-Weinberg equations. The key to understanding these equations and doing these problems is that you have to be able to read and figure out what they're giving you. Are they giving you P? Are they giving you Q? Are they giving you 2PQ? And then deciding what you're going to have to solve for. You're going to use that information to maybe solve for Q squared or P or Q. So let's do some practice reading through these problems and determining what they're giving you and what they want you to solve for or determine. So it says in a population with two alleles, big A and little a, the frequency of the allele A is 0.3. Frequency of the allele. They're not telling you the frequency of the people who are little a, it's the frequency of the allele. They're giving you Q. Q equals 0.3 because they said the frequency of this recessive allele. The question goes on to say, what is the percentage of the population that is homozygous for this allele? So they want to know the percent of the population that would be little a, little a. Little a individuals are represented by Q squared. So they want you to determine Q squared in this situation. Example 2, in a population of certain frogs in which the allele for brown skin is dominant to the allele for green skin, a drought leads to selection against the green-skinned frogs. Only 12% of the remaining frogs are green skinned. So that means that only 12% of our frogs are going to have that recessive genotype. So let's say little b, which codes for green skin. They gave you in this situation the percent of the population that is homozygous recessive. They gave you Q squared, and they're saying Q squared equals 0.12. Now it says calculate the frequency of the dominant allele. They want us, again, frequency of the allele means they want you to calculate P. Now for examples 3, 4, and 5, hit pause and go through and see if you can determine what information they're giving you and what they want you to solve for. It is critical that you are able to do that to work any of these problems related to Hardy-Weinberg. Example 3 says, in a population that's in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, just ignore that for now. It's no big deal. We'll talk about what that means. It says the frequency of the dominant allele, is 0.4. So they're giving you P, and they're saying P is 0.4. What is the percentage of the population heterozygous for the allele? They want you to solve for 2PQ, because that number is going to represent the frequency of the individuals in the population that are heterozygous. Example 4, in peas, a gene controls flower color such that R, purple, is dominant to white. In an isolated pea patch, there are 36 purple flowering plants and 64 white flowering plants. So they're giving you information, they're just giving it to you in a different way. Now, here's an important tip for you. If you're given information about dominant phenotypes and recessive phenotypes, you always want to solve and figure out the numbers related to the recessive phenotypes and genotypes first. Now here's what I mean about that. In this problem, they're saying there's 36 purple flowering plants. Purple is dominant. There's 64 white flowering plants. White is recessive. We want to use this information, and we're going to ignore this dominant information right now. So it says that 64 out of 100, because when we add them up, we have a total number of 100. And so that gives us 0.64. So it means 64% of the population has that homozygous recessive genotype. So what they're giving you, by giving you these numbers, is they're allowing you to calculate that Q square equals 0.64. Q square represents the frequency of the individuals that are homozygous recessive. And it would be 64% or 0.64 in this case. They want you to determine the frequency of the purple allele. That's the dominant allele. So they want you to figure out what P is. Example 5 is another example where they're going to give you information and you have to use the recessive information. Example 5 says you sample a population of butterflies and find that 56% show the dominant phenotype. You cannot work from this information. You have to start with information related to the recessive phenotype. That means 44% is showing the recessive phenotype. That means 44% are little a, little a. So what they're giving you is Q squared, because that's the percent of the population, the frequency of the population that is homozygous recessive, equals 0.44. Says what is the frequency of the recessive allele in this population? Then they're trying to get you to solve for Q. Now we're going to work all of these problems and solve for what they want you to determine here in just a second. But it's critical that you can read the word problems and figure out what information they're giving you and what they want you to solve for. Now that we've gotten familiar with the terms like allele frequency or frequency of different genotypes and how they relate to the equations, let's go ahead and solve. So in example 1, they gave us the frequency of this recessive allele. They were giving us Q. We said Q equals 0.3. They want the percent of the population that is homozygous for this recessive allele, so the percent that's little a, or little b, little b. So they're trying to get us to solve for Q squared. If we know Q, then this is a pretty easy problem, because we just simply take 0.3 and we square it, and that gives us 0.09. Remember, the question says, what is the percent of the population that is homozygous? So we're going to have to turn this into a percent. We times this by 100, and that simply means that 9% of the population would be homozygous recessive, like little a, little a. In example 2, they gave us the percent of the population that was showing that homozygous recessive phenotype. They were giving us Q squared. So Q squared equals 0.12. And they want us to calculate the frequency of the dominant allele. That is P in that equation. P plus Q equals 1. Now, if we know Q squared equals 0.12, then simply to figure out what Q is, we just have to square root 0.12. And that's going to equal 0.35. So Q equals 0.35. Now let's go back to this equation. P plus Q equals 1. So basically, we're going to solve for P. So if P plus 0.35 equals 1, then to solve, we have to subtract 0.35 to solve for P. So P basically equals 1 minus 0.35, and that gives us 0.65. So 0.65 is your answer. But let's just take a second to think about this. So if we have the frequency of the recessive allele at this, then the rest of the alleles have to be the dominant alleles. So if we just simply take 1 minus 0.35, then it's going to tell us the frequency of the dominant alleles. In the next example, they give us the frequency of the dominant allele. So they're saying that P equals 0.4. And they want us to determine the percentage of the population that is heterozygous. So they want us to determine 2PQ. Well, if we know P, we should automatically know Q, because P and Q have to add up to 1. So if P equals 0.4, then that means Q is going to equal 0.6. And then we just have to plug those values into this equation. So we take 2 times 0.4 times 0.6, 2PQ, and that's going to give us 0.48. And let's go back to the question. It says, what percent of the population is heterozygous? So that means we have to turn this into a percent, so we just times by 100. 48% of the population is heterozygous, like big A, little a. Now, there's a second part to this equation. It says, if the population is made of 800 individuals, how many would be hybrids? So this is just another way of saying how many would be heterozygous. So if we have 800 individuals, and we know 48% of them should be heterozygous, then we just times this by 0.48, and that's going to give us the answer of 384 individuals would be heterozygous out of a population of 800. Example 4 gave us information about individuals that have the dominant phenotype and those that have the recessive. And you have to remember that we always have to work basically from the recessive numbers that were given. So we know that white is recessive, and we said 64 divided by 100 is giving us the percent of the population that would be showing this recessive phenotype. So 64% is homozygous recessive. So we have little r, little r. So they're giving us 0.64 equals Q squared, because Q squared is the percent of the population that shows the recessive phenotype. Now, they want us to determine the frequency of the dominant allele. So they want us to determine P. So first, we need to be able to solve for Q. So if we take 0.64, and basically we're going to square root it, because if we square root Q squared, then we're just going to be left with Q. So the square root of 0.64 is 0.8. So 0.8 equals Q. If you know Q, then you know P, because Q plus P have to add up to 1. So if we see the frequency of the recessive allele is 0.8, then that means the frequency of the dominant allele is going to be 0.2. And so you can report your answer as 0.2, or if they ask what percent of the alleles would be the dominant alleles, then you have to change it to 20%. So here's your answer. In example 5, they're giving us that 56% show the dominant phenotype. Now students have a tendency to mess up problems like this because this is what they're going to do. They say 0.56 equals P squared, but that's not the case. 56% is showing the dominant phenotype. Individuals that are homozygous dominant are going to show the dominant phenotype, and so do the individuals that are heterozygous for the trait. So these two numbers would add up together and would give us 0.56. So this is why you can't work from the information about the dominant phenotype. You have to gain information about the recessive phenotypes and start from there. So on the previous page, we indicated that they gave us Q squared, because Q squared would be 0.44. And I got that because if 56% are showing the dominant phenotype, that means 44% are showing the recessive phenotype, or they have the recessive genotype. So if we have Q squared, we can solve for Q. So let's square root both. So Q squared square root 0.44 square root. So the square root of 0.44 is 66. And that's what they wanted us to determine. The frequency of the recessive allele is Q. So our answer is 0.66. Now that we understand how we can calculate allele frequencies, let's take a look at another way that they can give you allele frequencies and ask you about the evolution of a population. So here we have a graph, and you can see that it is documenting the frequency of a dominant allele over time. And if you know the frequency of the dominant allele, then you should know the frequency of the recessive allele, because you can use that equation, P plus Q equals 1. Let's take a second to read through example 6. It says the graph shows the change in allele frequencies over time in a population. Is the population evolving? Well, actually the question prompt tells you that the population is evolving, because we know that evolution is simply the change in allele frequencies. And we can see that the allele frequencies are changing from generation to generation. Initially, we had allele frequencies of 0.5 and 0.5. And then we have allele frequencies of 0.2 and 0.8 for the recessive allele. So yes, the population is evolving. B says, what is the recessive allele frequency in generation 2? When we come over here to generation 2, we can see that the frequency of the dominant allele is 0.2. So again, using that equation, P plus Q equals 1. If P equals 0.2, then Q equals 0.8. So the answer would be 0.8. What percent of the population in generation 2 would show the dominant phenotype? This is somewhat of a tricky question, because whenever you see dominant, and we're talking about phenotypes, I think students are automatically going to think they want me to solve for P squared. If you think about it, the individuals that are big A are going to show the dominant phenotype, and they're represented by P squared. But also, the individuals that are going to be heterozygous for the trait are also going to show the dominant phenotype, and that's represented by 2PQ in our equation. So if we know P and Q, then we can solve for this problem. We just have to plug in the numbers. So P is 0.2, so we're going to square that. We're going to add 2 times 0.2 for P, and then Q is 0.8. This equals 0.04, and this is going to equal 0.32. So when we add those together, we're going to get 0.36. Remember though, the question says, what is the percent of the population that would show the dominant phenotype? We need to change this into a percent. So ultimately, I'm just going to add it over here because I'm out of room. Our answer is 36%, because we're going to take 0.36 times 100. D says, is the population in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium at the beginning? Now, I know why they're asking this question, because a common misconception that students have is what we mean by Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. We see this word equal, and we think that it means that the frequency of the dominant and the recessive allele must be equal. And you can see that it is here at the beginning of our graph. 0.5 represents the dominant allele, 0.5 represents the recessive allele. That is not what to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium means. So let's talk about that. If a problem says the population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, it simply means that the population is not evolving from generation to generation. It does not mean that the allele frequencies are equal to each other. So I'm going to put a big line through it so you know this is not what it means to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. So this is what we mean by Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Let's say we have a dominant allele frequency of 0.7, so our recessive allele frequency is 0.3. And this was in 2005. And when we look at that population later, like in 2010, we see that the allele frequency is exactly the same, 0.7 and 0.3. Then we would say that the population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Notice my allele frequencies here to here are not the same. It's just from year to year. The dominant and the recessive allele frequencies are not changing over time. So when we go back up to D, we're going to say, no, the population is not in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, because we can see at the beginning here, so if you look through the first two generations, we can see the population evolving, because we can see allele frequencies changing over time. The population is not in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium because allele frequencies are changing. So for E, it says, identify the conditions that would lead to evolution or the population not evolving. Well, we know that the population is evolving. So what could be causing the population to evolve? That's going to be those different agents of evolution. So we could list natural selection, mutations, gene flow, genetic drift, artificial selection, sexual selection, etc. Those are the things that cause populations to evolve. If the population was not evolving, then we would have to say, well, that means that there was no natural selection taking place in the population, that there was no mutations occurring, there was no sexual selection, and so those are the conditions that would have to be met for a population to not be evolving. This information down here is just emphasizing this idea that these conditions must be in place for a population to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, or basically not be evolving. Now, since this scenario rarely happens, that we do not see no mutations, no gene flow, no genetic drift, no natural selection, sexual selection, and artificial selection, then we know that populations are evolving all the time. Note that a common theme or concept to ask on an AP exam related to evolution is, what are the conditions that must be met for a population to be in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium? So you need to know that means that no evolution is occurring, and these are the ideas that you would have to list or explain that would show why a population is in Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium.